In a second-hand set of dimensions, on an astral plane that was never meant to fly, through wavering star mists, see the Grey Satuin. Drifting onwards through space, atop the shell of the world's turtle, are 4 giant elephants, upon whose broad shoulders rests the Discworld. Welcome to Dining Table Discworld. We're reading through the Discworld novels and discussing them at our dining table. Be aware there will be spoilers for the current book and others in the series.
Hello, welcome to Dining Table Discworld. I'm Dave.
I'm Kathy.
And today we are talking about the 14th book in the Discworld series. This would be Lords and Ladies, which was published in 1992. Interestingly, the same year Small Gods was published, so we're packing 2 in a year.
I think this is during his very prolific time because he also published a lot in 1990 and 91.
Yeah. We get only 1 next year, 93. Yeah, so I think it's not quite a 2 a year. Anyway, what's the synopsis on Lords and Ladies?
The witches return to Lancre after more than a year away. Magrat finds that she's engaged to King Verence, with the wedding preparations close to done, but the problem is he'd never actually proposed. Meanwhile, it's circle time, and crop circles alert Nanny and Granny to danger up at the old stone circle called the Dancers. Plus, Granny worries that she's losing her faculties. After the older witches refuse to tell her what's up, Magrat angrily leaves the coven and moves into the castle since she's almost queen. In their absence, some young women set up a coven, and the leader, Diamanda, challenges Granny to a witching contest, which Nanny helps to resolve. As dignitaries arrive for the royal wedding, Granny and Nanny both meet men from their past, distracting them at the moment that an old foe takes advantage of the young witch's resentment, and suddenly elves have taken over Lancre. Elves run riot through the kingdom, attacking and torturing with abandon. Magrat, who had found her brief time as almost queen excruciatingly dull, rises to the challenge to save her fiancé from the elven queen. Granny understands that her fears about her mind had a magical explanation and tries something unprecedentedly dangerous. Nanny visits a folkloric figure for help. Will Lancre and its king be saved?
Maybe. Okay, so we're back with the witches with only 1 book in between. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we last saw them on their holidays abroad.
In fact, this is, I think, the main Discworld book where Pratchett writes a note at the beginning saying this is direct continuity from a previous one.
Yes. Well, actually, it doesn't. It also mentions equal rights, which kind of throws my...
It does throw your Weatherwax headcanon out of whack, but there we go.
I'm very disappointed. But how dare he have,
we did read all these books before, so...
Yes.
But it's fine to not remember things.
Yeah, I didn't particularly remember that. Yes, well, we're going to start with that. I have read this a few times, but not massively. So I remembered a decent amount of it, and, I enjoyed it. It's, I think the Witches ones are one of the stronger themes for the series. And it helps if you understand the what it's riffing off more than I did Small Gods, so...
I'm assuming by that you mean the quantum stuff Pond Simmons talking about, and less so the Shakespearean bit.
Yeah, but at least I know Midsummer Night's Dream.
That's true.
Whereas I don't really know Greek philosophy.
There was very little Greek philosophy in Small Gods. It was mostly late others.
Exactly. I can't even identify when it is or isn't Greek philosophy. So, yeah, I've got a better handle on this, and I did have another point I was going to make, but I've lost it. So what did you think?
So this is another one I've always really liked. As I said, the Witches series is one of my faves. So yeah, I've definitely read this quite a bit. And yeah, I really liked it again. I think the folkloric stuff is the kind of thing I really like as well. And there's more of that. Obviously, we'll talk quite a lot about the main bit of that. But there's also stuff like the Morris, which I think was mentioned briefly in Reefer Man.
Yes, Reefer Man is the one of the dances that is done in secret.
But it's just kind of mentioned at the beginning and the end. That's it. It's like, well, where's the Morris dancing? Then this is where it was. Not that I personally am particularly into Morris, although we do have at least one friend that does it. But just I don't know, that sense of like this is really country-ish and folklorish and stuff like that is pretty good.
I've done my fair share of Morris dancing when I was in primary school.
We did something called country dancing, which I don't think was the same thing. I don't recall very well.
I suppose I was, they didn't want to harm girls with sticks too much.
No, I really like it, and I like it still. So
I think I've remembered my point I was going to make. I think I like the Witches more when they're in Lancre. I think I didn't, and now it might have been because the other setting didn't quite. The other book, which is where they were going through various settings. Mm-hmm. I just kind of like them. I seem to like them a bit more when they're embedded within.
Okay.
Like Just, you know,
Fair enough.
that just seemed to... I think that's what part of why I enjoyed it more than Witches Abroad.
Okay. There are sort of two big themes in the book, which I guess if we talk about those first, then we can perhaps go into some character stuff after that. So the first one's kind of the role of witches.
Yeah, I mean, and they all take different aspects of that role, as, you know. Granny's the one you go to, I think, if you want a good talking to. Perhaps not necessarily a...
She also does, like, the funerals laying out.
Yeah.
Although obviously she can midwife. They can all midwife.
Yeah, Nanny Ogg is the midwife, the kind of healing one. Magrat's good with potions, as you know.
Yes, I think, is it this one where it says something about there's a reason that Granny was a better witch, but there's a reason that Magrat was a better doctor?
Yeah. You know, I've broken my arm. It's fine. It's not a problem. It's like, but I've broken my arm. It's not a problem. Yes, Granny, it's not a problem. It's not the best way to possibly heal someone's
I don't think she
arm.
quite does that.
No, but, you know, it's...
So in this book, obviously, this coven of witches, our three main witches, have been away for over a year. And
Seeing elephants.
in that time, some young girls in Lancre have formed a coven, but it's very, it's very goth, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Magrat's kind of new agey, and I think in Magrat's section we'll talk a little bit about her age in general, but Magrat's kind of like, it's a bit new agey on the one hand, but also she's very practical and kind of wants to know why stuff works, why it works, which seems to be kind of like opposing forces within her as a person. But there's a romantic element to it. Whereas this is a gothic romantic element to it. So you've got these young girls. There's one girl who seems to be sent away to be educated and has come back. And she's got very modern ideas, which...
A lot of black lace as well.
Yes, I feel like when they say modern ideas, it's kind of like how people used to say millennials when I was like young. And kind of say it still, even though we're like middle-aged. We're getting there. We're getting there. So they're kind of led by Diamanda, which isn't her... This thing, none of the girls are using their real name. They've all got personas they're doing, which, I mean, is fine. But it's clear the other witches don't really understand that.
No, it's very much a... what? Yeah, you're very nice. You know, very nice name, Agnes, you know.
Yeah. It's sort of gothic. I mean, again, it was written in 92. Goth was quite a thing. I'm sure Pratchett had many goth fans.
Yes.
Certainly, you know, that was a vein in fantasy at the time. I think emo would be a bit later, but not dissimilar.
I now want to Google when an interview with a vampire was published.
Sure, yeah. It's probably satirising a sort of thing he was seeing out in the world, but I think they're saying it's very surface, it's very aesthetic, and there's lots about rights and the moon, and the kind of thing that you think Magrat would tie into a little bit, which is almost why I wonder why she was almost lifted away from the older witches before they deal with this. But with a, as you say, more black lace, gothic type twist to it. I imagine the absence of the older witches is how this grew up.
Well, yeah, I think if the other witches were there, I think they would have been, I say, apprenticed out relatively quick.
Or they would have done this and just stomped on them, because that's kind of what happens. Because this is the thing. In Witches Abroad, after Desiderata dies, that is also quite a fanciful name, but seems to be her actual name, is therefore fine.
And she was a fairy godmother.
Yes, and also a little bit more familiar with foreign stuff, I guess, was kind of their thing. But they actually have a conversation with a load of other older witches, who are presumably therefore around, but not the characters in this book, about how there aren't many young ones. It's kind of suggested Magrat's the last one who took over from anyone. They're like, we don't have any girls kind of lined up to take over anyone's cottages. Hence, Magrat ends up kind of taking over some of the stuff from Desiderata, although obviously that was part of the plot. So there does seem to be a bit of a recruitment issue in witching. But then a load of young girls have kind of filled some sort of void, even if it does seem to be mostly them doing stuff themselves. So there is stuff about them that maybe they're dancing, you know, naked up in the mountains. Maybe they're doing the more surface level appearance stuff. And I think that's what irks Nanny and Granny, because they're not looking at the practicalities. And that's where we come to the role of witches, particularly in Pratchett's book, which is obviously healers, social workers, community leaders, you know, just the wise women, the people you go to.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like these young girls are really doing that.
They want the trappings and I suppose some of the influence that comes with being a witch, and the
magic.
Yeah. But yes, not really understanding that actually a lot of it is community. A lot of it is not actually you doing anything. As we know for well, you know, it's not about using magic. You use magic when you absolutely have to, but a lot of it is talking and being nice or underhanded, depending on what the situation needs. But
I thought that's Nanny being nice and also underhanded.
Yes.
Like both those things.
But it's, they're all about building bridges and connections so that when you've got a problem...
And knowing what's happening in your area.
Yes, so nothing comes as a surprise, or at least you make it look like it's not a surprise.
Yeah. Or being a known resource, if you think about it, I mean, they're not great to Magrat, which we'll discuss. But A, she's very good at healing, and people know that. And that's useful. And she will help out when she needs to, and she'll get things done, even if she's like less sure, even if, as was kind of a thing in Weird Sisters, sometimes people are looking for the other witches, the more senior witches. But she's also a person that people go to for information. Like, she's sometimes the person who obviously reads letters to people who are illiterate.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, it's mentioned briefly in Guards, Magrat's the one who I think tells the local dwarves, about some stuff.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Because they say something about Mistress Garlic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the thing. They're just useful people in the community, and it doesn't seem like the young ones are doing that. They're more just, it's the trappings. But is that a reason to be like, stop this, you silly girls? Which does seem to be the attitude.
I think, it could have been handled in a... And I think it just got their backs up if they actually... Because obviously later on, one of these characters does actually...
do something dangerous.
Yeah, but also becomes more involved with the... Because they actually... she comes on board. And I think all three of them are... in it.
I thought it was more than three. I thought it was a few. We just don't get most of their names.
Yeah, we just, but...
So there's Diamanda, who's kind of the leader, and she ends up in this book doing something dangerous. And then, there's Agnes, but who's going by the name Perdita, more on which later, who, she will become more of a character. Yeah. And then there's some others that are in the background who just seem to be silly girls with black nail polish.
Yeah.
And again, I think it does reflect that attitude that sometimes older people have to younger people. Who be like, oh, they're just particularly girls. Oh, they're just silly girls. And that silly girl attitude is also a big problem for Magrat, who I feel is somewhere in between. And again, I feel her being lifted out at that point in the plot is on purpose.
But I think coming back to the recruitment, I think it's they need to modernise their pitch. The witches don't have a modern to bring in to these young girl witches. What they see these trappings, and that's kind of what. Then they're not interested so much in the community stuff.
Well, does this feel a bit like recruiting healthcare professionals now, which is...
I think it goes into a lot of things, I think, recruitment,
It's like, we need this public service and we need people to do it.
Yeah, and perhaps the popular perception of that role is different to actually what it is. I take my own vocation. People just presume I get to talk about books all day, and I do get to talk a lot about books, but there is a huge amount of other stuff that...
Yes, it's very hard to explain libraries because it's like so many different things.
Yes, but the public perception is I stamp books out, I put books on shelves, and it's like, well, yes.
There was the time when I was working in the library where one of the borrowers came in, looked at us, who are all, at work, standing at computers, doing things in the library, going, oh, I'd love to be able to sit around and read books all day. And it's a bit like, I couldn't say it because I was at work. It was a bit like, yes, me too, and clearly that's not what I'm doing, is it?
But I think it's the same sort of idea that the public perception is one thing, but actually there's so much more depth to it.
Yes.
And you need to be able to recruit people that are willing to... who like the look of the trappings, but also are willing to go the whole hog.
Yes. No, that's fair enough. But I mean, much later in the series, there's then like a whole new generation thing.
Yes.
But we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the role of witches there. So what happens is Diamanda challenges Granny to... she wants to do a competition of witching.
Yes.
Okay. And they're a bit like, well, Granny's going to wipe the floor with her. She knows so much magic. Granny being obviously one of the most powerful magical characters in the books, although one of the things is she doesn't use it very much. But then it turns out that what she says is they need to do a staring contest. And it's like, okay. And she's like, no, you're going to outstare the sun. Which is just weird. Like, I thought it'd be some sort of weird mystical thing. Which is just like, no, you just need to stare at the sun. It's like, well, that seems foolish. And then what happens is that Nanny, as she often does, kind of like works around things.
I mean, realising that Granny's just going to blind herself before she gives up.
She also hadn't been feeling very well. And it's very hot because she hadn't been sleeping well and she was a bit worried about things. Basically, Nanny using a grandchild. Well, it's a little bit like when all the Oggs go out and stop the cocks from crowing in Weird Sisters. She kind of gets one of her grandchildren in a position where he stumbles and falls. And then Granny immediately goes and picks him up. And Diana's like, oh, I won. And they're like, say to the people of Lancre, it's like, is that what a witch would do? Or would a witch help a child who was in distress? And everyone's like, a witch would clearly help a child. Granny's clearly proves she's a better witch.
Yeah.
But that's kind of part of being a witch. It's like, well, you have to be a bit tricky and think of it sideways. So you want to be helping people, and also you want to go sideways or an odd angle of the situation, which again is a very Granny Weatherwax thing, which will happen a fair bit later.
Yes. It is. Yeah, seeing what you can do from outside the box at 90 degrees to where everyone else is.
Yes. But then, yes, obviously that resentment in Diamanda having clearly won a competition that she set, although, again, how was Sarah and Sunny useful?
Yeah.
That's not proof of anything particularly.
I mean, at least she had the right idea of not doing actual.
Don't do a magic battle.
Even if it was sword in the stone.
Yeah, well,
she would have lost.
Well, because I think Granny had already demonstrated her power to them previously a bit, but her resentment and this kind of rift in that, rather than Granny being a bit like, look here, let me show you how this can be, their kind of, winning kind of led Diamanda to go and listen to the Queen and go and allow route for the elves to start to infiltrate the kingdom. Speaking of elves, that's a massive thing in the book. And I noticed that Pratchett says elves and not fairies.
Yeah. Fairies is a separate entry in the companion.
Oh, okay. You checked this with companion. All right. Well, I think it's telling because somebody said this when we went to FantasyCon in September 2024. There was a whole panel on Fae and fairies. And somebody did sort of mention Lords and Ladies and said they felt like it was in direct conversation with Tolkien, which I can understand, and which may explain elves being the word used. There's also obviously a certain amount of not liking to use the word fairies. So many years ago it was either Alt Fiction or Edgelit, I saw a very, very interesting talk with Graham Joyce about kind of fairies and stuff. And he actually was saying something about not liking to say the word. And this was, I think, a bit after he'd published Some Kind of Fairy Tale, which is a very good book of his. And the fact is, obviously, as you say, for the first part of the book, no one says elf or fairy. They kind of purposely don't say the name. And you just sort of say, the fair folk.
Yes.
Or the people. Or, it's a very, there's a lot of euphemism around it. And there's all the stories about it, which is the whole thing where Granny and Nanny know what it's like actually with fairies. No, sorry, with elves. And some of them say elves, because in my head I'm always like fairies.
Yeah.
But most other people don't. Most other people have heard the stories. And again, we'll get to it in talking about Magrat, but they sort of underestimate Magrat and don't give her the information they need and assume she'll just be a silly girl.
Yeah.
Even though she's older than the other silly girls.
There's many silly girls, or perceived silly girls.
Well, I mean, it's probably kind of like that thing where when you've got like a street full of elderly people, the one they call the lad is the guy who's in his 50s.
Yeah.
So I think it's that sort of thing, which again, the greying of witches, I think, at this point. But yeah, do you feel like the book is in conversation Tolkien a bit?
Well, I mean, it's the elves are very different. Tolkien's elves are the bright light, they are the good, they are fair and just awesome. I'm not going to say they're Mary Sue's, but they are pretty awesome.
Elves are awesome. They inspire awe. Like Pratchett says it.
Yes. I think Pratchett is going and saying, hang on a second, all of these folklore stuff we have about is not that pretty, it's not that, it's a lot more dangerous, it's a lot more, you don't go sleeping on that particular place because you disappear for
100 years.
And we get more of the elf world in the Tiffany Aching books. But yeah, it's very much saying, hang on a second, as Tolkien as much of a scholar of
folklore.
Yeah, he read them very differently.
I mean, I think he knew that because he was obviously incredibly educated in this sort of thing. But I think what he was looking for, just because I'm also reading some essays about this in that Realms of Imagination book that we got at the exhibition from about a year ago. But Tolkien was looking to create an English-based folkloric system, which we obviously have, but I think he felt been a bit degraded and was looking at, I think, various traditions and things. I mean, it's obviously some, stuff like, there's some Norse stuff in there that he was obviously very interested in. I think there's some of the Irish I don't know, in my mind, we get told bits of it all together, but that sort of has a kind of noble, lordly, high magic, high status sort of aspect to it, which is different to the kind of more ground level common folk.
I think you look. I think if you want to go for D&D approach, or Warhammer.
Okay.
But your Tolkien's elves are the high elves. They're the you know the majestic ones. They're the whereas
Vulcans.
Yeah, Vulcans. Whereas the Pratchett elves are. I mean, they're
was dark elf, isn't it?
I wouldn't necessarily dark elf, but they're not.
I don't really know what the difference between that is. I just assume it's this, if I'm honest. It's like these are nice and these are creepy.
A bit more dark elves are very twisted.
So are these ones. They were literally trying to torture people.
True, fair point.
These are
dark elves. Yes.
So, I mean, the bit that Pratchett has, so after the elves sort of appear, there's this great bit where he goes through, because there's this whole idea that every time Nanny and Granny are trying to deal with the problem, they won't say it out loud and they're trying to talk around it with the euphemism. But when they sort of tell people, even so, Nanny's son Jason, who's the blacksmith, and therefore should know about this sort of thing because of his connection with iron and that sort of thing. Even he's a bit like, oh, but aren't they nice? When people start to tell them.
The blacksmith's is this strong sort of community.
Yes,
it's grounded in the earth tradition. Very, very male witch-esque.
Yes, in fact, I watched a documentary quite a long time ago, and probably on Channel 4, which was almost suggested that the idea of like a pointy hat, like a witch or wizard, came from some sort of hat that was used by metal workers. Because at one point, creating like metal, a useful thing out of rock, was probably a bit magical.
Well, true, yes.
That may have been a stretch. I don't know. I'm not up to date with that sort of thing. But anyway, it was an interesting idea.
I think Jason is a kind of that kind of
Yeah. There's this bit, perhaps this was really good partway through, when the elves arrive, so we can start saying elf. Elves are wonderful. They provoke wonder. Elves are marvellous. They cause marvels. Elves are fantastic. They create fantasies. Elves are glamorous. They project glamour. Elves are enchanting. They weave enchantment. Elves are terrific. They beget terror. The thing about words is that meanings can twist just like a snake, and if you want to find snakes, look for them behind the words that have changed their meaning. No one ever said elves are nice. Elves are bad.
Yeah.
Which is just amazing, because I think having read various, say, fairy stories, and it's different to fairy tales, bits and pieces before that, and I got to this, and it's a bit like, no, this is heavy, nasty stuff. But if you think about it, there's that tradition of people leaving milk out for the elves, people saying the fair folk, people not going to certain places, people like doffing their caps in certain times. Just this idea of this incredibly powerful, capricious force that could just sweep you up and do something terrible to you. It's a very regular person ground level, that working class kind of folklore.
Yes.
And so if it's written down, it might have been printed up for the more literate people at various points, in recording stuff. But, there's certain things people do, and sometimes they're called the gentry, which I think is telling, it's a bit like, maybe it's forces of nature, but maybe it's just some big fancy lord comes down, changes your life and there's nothing you can do. Yeah. It's this idea of forces that are outside your control, and that probably operate on different logic or different systems yourself.
Yeah, but you can tell there's lots of things that are not in Lancre communicate. So they've got the dancers, which is the stones around
stone circle,
where this kind of weakness in reality is that could let the elves through.
Yes, because the whole point is there's kind of like other worlds that it's kind of parallel universes, and it's a parasite universe that travels between the others and tries to latch on to something.
They know that they stop them, but they don't. It's a little bit of a.
Well, it's meteorite rock, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's
which is interesting when you consider what Pratchett got when he was knighted.
Yes. That man was kitted out for if the elves ever came back.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, when Sir Terry was given his knighthood, he actually got a sword forged from rock from meteorite. I don't even know how you source that. I mean,
to be fair, if someone came up to me and said, that meteorite rock you have, can I have it for Terry Pratchett? I'd have said yes. So,
but where have you got meteorite rock?
Yeah, that's my point. That's where it's falling apart. I'm just saying.
But so the point is, and there's a lot of stuff because obviously the elves are damaged by iron, and again, that's very basic folklore. Again, in Tolkien, they seem to have all sorts of goods. What are those made of? It's not really relevant. But I think where it's in conversation in Tolkien is Tolkien's trying to do this high lordly stuff, and Pratchett's a bit like, you've taken out all of the nasty crap that exists in these folk stories. But yes, the idea of, and again, like horseshoes over houses, you still see it now.
Yes.
Having a lucky horseshoe, you get stuff like, not an actual iron horseshoe, but you get stuff when you're married, like here's a horseshoe thing.
My grandparents had one above their back door.
It's the back door, the door they used.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. Front doors are only for weddings and funerals.
Yeah,
which I think is in one of these books. Yeah. I can't remember which one it is, but yeah.
As I was talking about, sort of, so most of the stories would have been oral stories, and so you wouldn't have had. So they didn't know, I say, about the meat of the rocks, why it was. It's only when I think Ponder Stibbons towards the end is there with a nail, and it's kind of going bing.
Well, it's clear early on it's magnetic, but that's to us who knows about magnets.
Yes. Magnets are magics. Magnetism can do many things. See Silver Age X-Men.
Yeah, sure.
Or don't if you want science.
That doesn't seem quite as relevant as the stuff I was going to reference.
Sorry.
Because one thing that's very good, which I read recently, was Kit Whitfield's In the Heart of Hidden Things, which is very much this idea you've got the people and, fae stuff, but then you've also got the actual, Lords of the Land, who are almost as remote and terrifying. Well, actually, they're less remote. Sorry, not less, they're more remote, because they're kind of far away but could bring death down on you. Whereas the the dog that runs and mauls you, there's a certain amount of times, there's a certain logic to that.
Yeah.
And people just stay away from there at night. But, if a lord turns up, what are you going to do? It's just this interesting thing of the fact they're called the gentry and stuff. Yeah. And obviously the stuff with the glamour is very big thing, because you've got the queen. It's all surface level. It's all look how beautiful we are. I've not read that much Tolkien. I've watched the films. I'm aware of a lot of the conversations around it. And I kind of have this with Vulcans as well. There's this idea that they just look too pretty and fancy and superior. Look at us. Yes, we're all tall.
They are.
With our smooth hair, although it's short for Vulcans, I appreciate. And our far superior way of being. Look, we live in a tree and everything's all shiny and magic. And it just seems... I think I have a bit of a suspicion of glamour.
Yeah.
Both the illusory magic that obviously fae type creatures and elves are supposed to have. Again, I don't think Tolkien goes into that. These people are still magically fancy and never need to comb their hair.
Tolkien, the glamour is just them. There is no magical effect.
See, I'm immediately suspicious of that.
They are just that.
They never need to comb their hair. No. They're never going to get the wind blow their hair into their faces.
No, if the wind blows their hair, it does it in a very dramatic fashion.
Exactly. It's
possibly straight up, so it goes back.
It's like they're living an Instagram filter.
Yes.
And I've always been a bit suspicious of that. And obviously that again feels quite modern, as I think we mentioned before, with this idea of everything looks perfect and wonderful and properly made up, but it's all surface and it's not real.
I think so. Yeah, the glamour that Pratchett elves have got. Again, I don't feel that it's actually something that
it's a little bit different.
It's very much you look at something going, that is pretty, but it's not something you can put your finger on why it is.
I think the stories have made the idea that they're pretty and lovely, but actually when you look at them, it's like, oh, that's nice, but also a little bit wrong.
Yeah.
Which, now that I'm saying it, is a bit like AI art. You're like, it looks very shiny and nice, but also not really correct.
I think because when they talk about things like the horses that aren't, again, they're glamoured horses, so that when you start looking at them, it's like, that's not a horse.
Well, there's that whole thing on the internet, a bit like, we've come back to Fae folk days. It's like, is this an illusion? Count the fingers.
Yeah. I think that's reasonable. I think, again, the glamour's there as a... it messes with your mind and puts a, perception, but...
Shows how we just keep having this stuff in some form or another, don't we? There's one bit I want to talk about with Nanny. So there's the queen of the elves, and she kidnaps Verence. And then that goes into the whole kind of story thing, because then Magrat ends up being in a position of having to save her. And he doesn't say it specifically, but he mentions something that obviously references like Thomas the Rhymer and Tam Lin. But at one point, the queen changes how she looks to mock Magrat, because Magrat's obviously blonde and skinny and small-chested and a bit unsure of herself, and quite often has needs to blow her nose. Again, why I found her so relatable when I was a teenager. So what the queen does when she's captured Verence is she turns herself into, and Granny sees her do it, she turns herself into this weird idealised version of Magrat. So blonde, but lovely wavy hair, not like straw, curvy, but still slender, but probably fairly busty. Granny kind of watches her do that and sees that what she's doing is kind of cruel. I don't think it goes into how Magrat perceives that, but it's the idea that the queen has been like, right, that's your weakness, and I'm going to absolutely do something that makes you feel worse about yourself, that makes you feel inferior. So that's kind of the big side of that. Then the other side of it is what Nanny does as a solution, which Although I feel like Nanny again plays a bit of a backseat role to Magrat and Granny plot-wise, or like some character development and stuff, she does end up being the main solution.
I mean, she comes in with the clutch save at the end. I do feel like it's a similar role to Witches Abroad in that she's kind of there and she's doing her own thing. She's supporting the story going forward, but Granny's doing the powerful, or at least being the focus of the power. And yet Nanny's just kind of doing, I'm going to go do my thing. It's equally as powerful, but it's just...
So what Nanny does is, we'll get into it, but she's having a date and it gets interrupted because elves invade. She ends up going to the Long Man, which is an earthworks. It's 2 circles and a long thin bit.
It's a very, very specific part of a existing... chalk outline.
Yes, basically it's this phallic sort of structure. She goes to this kind of, and it's the thing, she says it's a male place, it's a masculine place. Like she said her grandfather would go there, like the young men would go there, sometimes the grandfather would go. And then her companion, Castle Under the Dwarf, is a bit like, oh, how do you know what they did? And he's like, he's like, were you there hiding in the bushes? She's like, how did you know? But that's, because that is what Granny would do. Not Nanny. It's quite annoying to me that there are 2 characters' whose names rhyme in these books, because I'm just always saying the wrong thing out loud. But yes, Nanny would go there. I think it's a bit of a mirror of the fact that with the young witches, one of the guys from the village quite often tries to follow them to see if they're dancing naked. Yes. But there's, Nanny a generation earlier or so, like doing the same thing with the young men. But yes, it was very much a man's place. And she said that's why Esme would never think of it, because that's just not part of her world or her experience. Yeah. In fact, she doesn't like that kind of thing. But obviously Nanny, very much so. So she goes down into this place, and it's kind of, this is where you get the kind of earthen thing, like the Queen's realm. It's always, there's lots of parallel worlds, and it's like a parasite one that like latches on stuff, and that's kind of what causes crop circles as a plot device, I guess.
Yeah.
This is actually going under the earth. And again, that's a very old and ancient idea, like having earthworks like going into the ground. Yeah. It's quite often got an underworld type connotation to it. But in this, they basically, and it's like a sweat lodge. It's very sweaty and it
manly,
musky, and I guess. And then they meet a guy who's the king.
Yes.
And it's clear they're sort of, him and the Queen are separated, but he's the only person who's kind of someone proud of her. And he's basically a gigantic horns guy who, as Cassandra says, looks a lot like his picture. So he's presumably not clothed. But it's just that Nanny's actually willing to go to him and say, and he argues like, well, why shouldn't our people go? And Nanny gives this incredibly powerful speech. And she's like, look, you can't rule again. There's too much iron and music in the world. Because that's the other thing, that music
distracts them.
Music tames wild beasts. Yeah. They're kind of fascinated enough by music that will stop them from what they're doing. The king says one day, and she's like, oh yeah, one day. Oh, because that's the other thing, like, there's the idea that people like the idea of the elves, which is part of the Queen's grammar, but also Nanny kind of likes the king. She likes the idea of it, but she knows the practicality. So she goes, everyone needs one day, but it ain't today. Do you see? So you come out and balance things up. Otherwise, this is what I'll do. I'll get them to dig into the Long Man with iron shovels, you see? And they'll say, well, it's just an old earthworks. And pinched off wizards and priests with nothing better to do will pick over the heaps and write dull old books about burial traditions and such like, and that'll be another iron nail in your coffin. And I'll be a little bit sorry about that, because I've always had a soft spot for you, but I've got kiddies, you see. And they don't hide on the stairs because they're afraid of the thunder, and they don't put milk out for the elves, and they don't hurry home because of the night. And before we get back to them dark old ways, I'll see you nailed. And it's just this idea that, yeah, the elves, the stories, the power, the glamour, or even, and he doesn't use glamour, but whatever he's got, it's something big and impressive and wild, and it draws people, but it's dangerous. And Nanny's like, we will not go back to the dark times. And that's what makes him basically deal with the Queen. But yeah, it's just that Nanny says, she can understand the story, the need in people, but it's not worth the price.
No.
And I think the whole thing with the glamour is also, there's this idea that all the younger people don't know what it's like, because Nanny and Granny are old enough that they kind of remember. I don't think the elves even came through before, but they'd heard the stories and they knew enough to know what it was like.
And also, I think it's
Also, the Queen tried to tempt Granny when she was young.
Yes, but also I think there's a certain degree of the older generation trusting the stories of the past perhaps a bit more than the...
Well, it's an interesting thing, because everyone's like, oh, I thought they were nice. There's kind of a thing, and it's relevant in a lot of stuff, where if something bad hasn't happened for about 3 generations, you sort of think, oh, that wasn't that bad.
Yeah. Well, it's a living memory thing.
When stuff starts going out of living memory, people don't guard against it anymore. And you can see that now. You can see that with fascism coming back. You can see that with public health stuff being ignored. Yeah. It's like, oh, well, our natural immune system will deal with, all these illnesses. No, it won't. It's like the reason that we need vaccines, like all these things stopped when the vaccine happened, but it's been so long since that happened, people are a bit like, oh, we don't need this. It's like, we absolutely do. That's why we're safe. But people don't remember what guards them. And so they get rid of it. And I think I've seen some people say it's about 3 generations, as you say, about living, or just over living memory. And the stuff with people not understanding what dancers are and why they're called dancers, but you mustn't dance there.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And it just feels like it's tapped in something very strong, a bit like people have only remembered, oh, how pleasant this was, and not what they have to do to guard against it.
They've remembered the glamour, but not the they remember the superficial stuff, but not the actual depth of meaning of it.
Yeah. Do we want to do like a quick go through some of the main characters?
Yeah, we'll have to.
So I guess Magrat is a big one, this, as we mentioned a bit. So, like I said before, she's kind of the young one. But actually, when you read this, it sort of is the first book which says, oh, maybe not so young anymore. And I think when you first read, or some of the earlier books, it seems like she's maybe early 20s. But it does say in here she's been a witch for over 10 years. Now, they do start as teenagers, but that's got to put her in mid-20s, maybe late 20s.
Yeah.
And again, I wonder if she's the young one because the others are so old.
I mean, quite easily.
It doesn't seem like she's in the first flower of youth, and therefore, like, there's kind of the idea that her and Verence getting married, that neither of them is perhaps quite as much a spring chicken as they might have seemed earlier.
Yeah. I'm willing to say that, she's at least 25 to 30 in that kind of window.
Yeah, she could even be early 30s, but I wouldn't say much older than that, no.
Well, technically quite a bit older, given the time shift in...
Let's not get into that, it's too confusing.
Sorry.
Parents were still in the kingdom when that happened, so it's fine. And it's also understandable why she feels left out, because the whole thing is Nanny and Gran are like, oh, well, we won't tell Magrat that, the crop circles are happening, or that it's circle time, what that means. So they're obviously worried about something. She can see that. They refuse to tell her. It's like, oh, Magrat's a wet hen. Magrat would be welcoming them. It's like, because you've not given her the information. Of course she's just going to believe the general stories around. That's all she's heard. You need to tell her what this means, why it's a problem. And even if she doesn't believe it at first, they just don't even tell her and trust her. And she knows that's happening. And she already feels peeved. And they're kind of, her coven's kind of her support network. They exclude her, basically. So they basically push her into going to the castle, at which point she goes around being almost queen and finds it just terribly dull.
I think as well, they are obviously trying to push her towards being queen.
Well, they're trying to push towards being Verence's wife, which I think includes being queen. And obviously being queen is not as good as being a witch.
No.
But they are pushing her out, and that does seem quite unfair. There's also the fact that, she turns up and Verence basically explains to her the wedding plans. And she's like, but you didn't ask me. But then everything's happening.
He's read a book about it.
This is one thing I will say, that Verence and Magrat are very suited for each other, because they were like, I'm not sure what to do. I'm going to get a book about it. It just does make them very relatable. What's the fact we just said that in unison? So she's in this vulnerable situation. Also, perhaps just a keen observer of human behaviour, and it's not unusual for people who are going to be brides to go a little bit spare. You don't get told about it, but it happens. I've had it. I know other people had it.
I think in this situation as well, she's getting married and all these things are happening around her, but she has no input into it. It's even worse than when you actually get married, because at least if you're hopefully planning your own wedding. But I think it's...
Well, that can be part of the problem as well.
Well, that's fair enough, yes. But in this situation, she's not planning anything. She has no input into it.
Stuff's just being happening to her.
Yeah, she's got engaged when she wasn't even there. She just came back and, you're getting married. Exactly. Who's coming to the wedding? It's like
that's the thing. All these dignitaries have been invited. It's a lot of pressure for something that she wants. I mean, this thing, it kind of happens because Granny knows Magrat sabotages herself, and probably it would drag it out. It wouldn't be great. So she kind of conspires with Verence to make it happen.
Yes.
But then, and so Magrat's just real angry when she finds out.
Which is fair enough.
Yeah. But also the fact that Magrat, then they're doing a lot of, because this is the other thing, Verence is trying to be king, and so they're doing a lot of ridiculous, not being allowed a lot of intimacy. They have to sit at either end of an incredibly long table while a servant runs back and forth, and she has to just do embroidery. All the queen stuff is incredibly dull, but she feels she's burned her britches with the witch stuff, and this is what she does now.
And she doesn't have a court, which, as in historically, you'd sitting embroidery, you'd have a queen court, but she hasn't got anyone except for the maid that's been assigned to her.
who's somebody she's known all her life, but is now calling her mum and bobbing at her all the time, and it's changed the dynamic between her and everyone else. But the fact is that she also sometimes plays on it. She's like, well, I'm almost queen, but then what else is she supposed to do? I think she's not in a great situation. You know, she talks to the beekeepers focused on his bees, the falcon guys focused on his falcons. They're like minor characters, but it's sort of funny when the elves turn up and they don't even know. They're like, what's happening? This isn't about my special interest. Oh, well.
Well, the beekeeper is very, because, bees and elves, very similar.
Wasps and elves. The elves are the wasps in this.
Yes. But, the falcon keeper.
But it's interesting that, again, so what happens is Magrat sees all these portraits of these dull, bored-looking queens, which, if it's so boring, you can kind of see why Variance exists.
Yes. Gotta do something with your time.
Basically, she's suspicious of this Baudelaire-ish sort of character. And she's like, oh, and then that seems to be the one interesting idea. And then...
Well, it's the idea of this warrior queen.
Yeah.
At least, someone who did something, who was,
Because at least as a witch, you get to do things, you get to be proactive, and everything's just being, done to and around her at that point. It's interesting that, like in Witches Abroad, you have a moment where Magrat's mental barriers are removed, and then she becomes terrifyingly effective.
Yes.
And also actually terrifying because she ends up going and murdering elves in this terrifying way. But what happens is she's kind of trapped in the armory. She sees this warrior queen's old armour, puts it on, feels like her spirit goes into her, and then she becomes all like Xena warrior princess.
Needs more padding, but yes. But it's and I think that's...
That's kind of like what Granny did to her at the ball in Witches Abroad.
But I mean, in some respect, this is it's about story and trappings, because it turns out later this queen never existed. It was entirely a fictional.
So some king made it up as like a nice background for the country.
So that's why the armour was there in such good nick, is because it was just it was good armour, but
it's like how the Victorians just make a load of stuff and go, this is very ancient. It's like, you guys just made this up.
Yeah. But but she gets the story helps her. Tap into...
Yeah. I feel like it's a shame we don't see more of her and Variance as a couple, and I feel like she's not being allowed that opportunity either, but it seems like they kind of make it work, after the fact.
Well, I think if they get some pieces... I think, yeah. I mean, it's...
Although there is that bit where she goes into Variance's room, isn't it?
Yeah.
And because when Variance was the fool, he would always sleep outside the door of his master, the king. And then she goes into his room... And she sees the bed's not been slept in. And then she sees that he is sleeping on the other side of the... door. So he's sleeping by the door to his room. Because first of all, he's not had a life where he slept in beds until quite recently. But also, it's this idea that he sleeps outside the door of his master, and his master's now the kingdom, so he's just on the other side of the door. Which is quite... And I think that's an actual moment of connection, although he's not there because he's been kidnapped. Where she sort of says, he's just got a different master now. And it just shows how Variance is... as a king, he wants to be a servant to his people because he's only ever been taught to serve, and also it sort of shows he's still that little guy with bells on that she first fell in love with.
Yeah, I mean,
he has to be king now, and all the trappings are kind of in the way.
Do we want to segue a little bit into Variance at this point? I feel
like I've said most of the things I had to say about Variance. He doesn't do a lot else.
No. But I mean,
if you want to say something,
I was just we get the farmer George. He's off trying to improve agriculture, because that's good for
set up crop rotation.
Yeah, and
he's read a lot of books.
Yeah, read a lot of books about it. So
everyone else is a bit perplexed, but he's the king, so I guess you just kind of.
But I think Variance is unlike Magrat, who's kind of drifting around, nothing to do. He's kind of forging ahead of wanting to do. If he's going to have to do this job, he's going to do it properly. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I thought that was an interesting reference that I only got after watching Bridgerton.
Okay, yes. I think you'd sort of said earlier about the stuff with Nanny, so I don't think there's really much more to go into with that. I think that, although in this, rather than being the kind of placating middle person, she's very much with Granny on, well, we're not going to tell Magrat about this. And it's like, wow, way to drive her away, guys. But anyway, so Granny.
I have nothing much to say about this character.
I mean, these books don't quite become the Granny books quite as much as the Watch books become the Vimes books, but let's face it, Granny and Vimes are very much the central points of their series. So Granny comes back and she starts realising she can't feel the echoes of the future. I'm going to say psychic for want of a better word, and I think there's a word Pratchett uses. All of her psychic, experience suddenly seems off. She's remembering things that didn't happen. She thinks she can't remember where things are. It's basically like an absolute ton of senior moments. But you kind of feel like Esme Weatherwax doesn't normally experience it. Like if Esme Weatherwax goes into a room, she knows why she's in that room. She's going to sort out. She's not going to go in the room and be like, why am I here? And why do I have to go to the other room to remember why she went to that room? And,
No.
But she's getting there. Everything's a bit vague, and she keeps remembering stuff like, oh, she remembers her wedding. Wait, she's not married.
Yeah.
Oh, the kid's going to do this. No, wait, I didn't have any children. And basically, I think she thinks she's losing her faculties, and obviously she's always been sharp as anything.
Yes.
And I think that's terrifying her. And she also, because she feels like an end point coming, she can't see a future.
Well, the whole point is witches always know when they're going to die. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what she thinks.
She thinks she's feeling that.
Yeah.
Yeah. She kind of thinks her time is up, but she's not going to tell anyone. And that's why she kind of... So it's kind of pride that makes her risk herself with staring at the sun with Diamanda. But she is preparing for it. She's got her box of, like, possessions. She writes up a will. So, yeah, she's kind of preparing for that. And then she gets a blast from the past. And I don't think she's a nostalgic person, but it turns out that when they were both young, Granny and Rid Cully had a relationship, which we consider they're the two kind of leaders of magic on the disc, or at least this bit of the disc.
I think what sort of relationship they had was... I think very tenuous. I mean, obviously, I think Rid Cully was a lot more interested in her than she was ever in Rid Cully.
Yeah, you kind of got the impression... Well, again, Nanny makes the point. It's like, when you're running around to get a young man to chase after you, at some point you have to stop. But it's like, Esme's not the kind of person going to let somebody outrun her. So, yeah, you get the impression that Rid Cully was chasing, and she was kind of, like, allowing a bit, but that wasn't... Her focus was on magic.
Yeah. Because, I mean, you definitely find out more in here that she wasn't anyone's choice to be a witch. She decided she was going to be a witch.
Again, I think it's interesting, actually. Well, so there's a lot of stuff in Gran's bit about, like, age versus youth, which is the whole thing with the witches there. Because the start of the book is actually young Esme running up to dancers and the elf queen trying to talk to her and saying, oh, I'll give you all this power and stuff. And she's like, no, I'll get it on my own. But she says something about the stupid old women.
Yeah.
And it's like, you're now the stupid old woman. Yes. If you live long enough, you become the stupid old woman you despise in your youth.
That's the thing. The witches at the time, she had no time for. She wanted, she wanted the power, but she's
a lot of daft old ladies who've never had a life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you just become the thing you despised. Not necessarily. And also, I don't think Granny ever despised it, but she made her choice. This was her focus. Her focus was never on family or romance. There's a bit with a unicorn where she tames it and she points out that she could have done that with anything because, the whole main thing. So it just kind of makes clear that basically Granny's not had anything to do with men otherwise.
All her knowledge is purely theoretical.
Yes, yeah, which I think is why she gets a bit uncomfortable with it, whereas obviously... And then I think that's also why she's very disapproving of Nanny being so open about sexual stuff, because for Granny it's... I don't know if she's fully sex repulsed, but I think there's an element of her being a bit like, and I don't know if that's like her having a very proper upbringing or her just actually not being that interested, but it definitely feels a bit sort of spectrum, I think, which is, fair enough. But she does kind of allow Rid Cully to distract her a little bit at one point. Well, I mean, he kind of being stupid sort of does transportation spells so they can be alone together, and then that's kind of when things start to go wrong. But what happened is it kind of converges that Ponder Stibbons was talking to Rid Cully about, like, alternate universes and, like, another universe, you did marry that girl. And, and he's like, well, I don't remember doing that. I was like, no, it was a different you.
But I didn't even get invited to my own wedding.
Well, and then Rid Cully tells Granny about this nonsense that Ponder's been saying, and she suddenly realises, that's what's happening because, of course, circle time is when the barriers between the worlds open, and that's how the elf land tries to get in. But it's also when she can get the radiation, as it were, from the other Esme Weatherwaxes, some of whom did get married, some of whom did have children and family, who probably did marry Rid Cully or maybe somebody else, all these things. And so the death that she feels coming may not be hers.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, but she's still kind of preparing for that. But there's the thing where she's confronting the Queen, and the Queen appears young and beautiful, but is ancient, but is also immortal. And when the Queen tries to threaten her with, I'll do this, I'll make you forget, I'll make it hard for you to walk. The Queen's threatening with all these things the Queen finds terrifying, and Granny's like, you threaten me with that, I who am growing old.
Yeah.
Because I think even though... she's obviously been old for a while. Although, again, it probably depends how old you are. If I was doing this podcast 20 years, I'd be like, no, she's a spring chicken. But it's this idea that I think this whole thing where she thought her death was approaching made her finally feel like she was old. And so that obviously spooked her. It's that the worst things that the Queen can think to threaten someone with, I'll keep you alive, but you'll witness all this. And she's like, that is... what I am living. So the elves don't have that.
No.
So this is how humans are. This is what we go through. This is our lives. And you're going to threaten us with something we already have that's already happening? You've got the young versus old with the witches, including it being a bit generational. But the elves are just always there. They're immortal, but they're neither young nor old. And they're certainly not old. They're just
them.
Yeah, they don't change. They don't grow, and they don't age. But it sort of shows that isn't necessarily the best. But yeah, I just thought that was like a really strong theme in there. The fact that, as well as seeing through the glamour, Grant is also a bit like...
There's nothing much you can threaten me with I'm not going to go through anyway.
Yeah. And it's just interesting that the elves are so afraid of this basic part of humanity.
Yeah.
Do we want to discuss other character bits?
Well, I mean, we're just throwing, because obviously, we got another appearance of Ridley. We get a bit more of his backstory as someone who grew up in Lancre.
I think he grew up in the Ramtops. I think he was visiting family in Lancre because it was like one summer.
Yes, but obviously that was also where he was hanging out when during sorcery.
Sorry, I was just thinking of like Summer Lovin. There's a weird crossover.
Yes, that's moving swiftly on.
Sure.
Well, that can be a Patreon episode.
It's just some words I said. What?
You'd be surprised what we can make. You can make it into a subscriber-only episode if you need to.
Okay, we still don't have subscribers. I don't know why you keep saying these things. We're not that organised. Anyway,
so yes, we get more of it coming in. I think it builds on him. You get to see him outside of the faculty, which is good,
and out in the countryside, which he's always going on about.
Yes,
when
he likes the countryside.
He likes to shoot bits of it.
Yeah, and obviously he's invited as head of the Unseen University
because it's a royal wedding.
Yes, because a royal wedding. So he brings along two of his faculty, Ponder Stibbons and the Bursar. Ponder Stibbons, and
the librarian.
Oh, and the librarian, yes. Shouldn't forget the librarian.
Because the thought is he'd like trees, even though they don't know if he's ever lived near any trees, but...
Yeah, because they just forget that he was once human. But
yeah.
But it's nice to see Ponder Stibbons will become another major...
This is the first time he appears as faculty.
Yes.
Because he was a student last time we saw him in Moving Pictures.
So yes, he's now head of inadvisably applied magic, as well as reader in invisible writings. Invisible writings being if you study all books have been written. So if you study the words that haven't been written, you can see what...
I think it's also inadvisably...
Inadvisable magic, that becomes later. But anyway, yes, we get Ponder Stibbons. Yes, he wanders around with the Bursar. The Bursar in Reaper Man, that's when he starts. So in Reaper Man, he starts having
mental health
issues. Yes, and in this, it's leaned into a lot heavier.
I mean, he was being shouted at a lot and was quite nervous about it in Moving Pictures. And then, in Reaper Man, it's clear that, he's having some trouble, but it's very background. But it's incredibly foregrounded with the Bursar that is like, he's...
I mean, he just comes out with these, random statements. He's got to take dried frog pills to kind of operate.
But then there's also a suggestion later that he has so many dried frog pills he detaches from reality in a different ways.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea is it seems that he's a very anxious, high-strung fellow, and being around Rid Cully is just basically sort of sent him over the edge. So that's a hostile working environment for sure.
Yes.
It's very much that he'll just say these random non sequiturs. It's very Madness of George III. Going back to George III, apparently.
Yeah. Two references in one podcast. There we go.
But it is being played for laughs.
Yes.
Like, look at this crazy guy at our office. He's going to say a funny thing, and then we'll give him some drugs to keep him quiet. And it's like, no, that's... doesn't feel so great now, does it?
No, and it is... It does feel wrong. If you kind of ignore the fact it's about someone with some sort of mental illness that's kind of being forced.
It's played for laughs.
Yeah, and it... And the trouble is, it doesn't go away. It continues through later books.
It's an ongoing joke. I think this is just, as you say, it was...
I mean, it was less of a problem in the 90s to make these jokes.
Oh, okay. I was going to say in the books it's been less obvious. This is where it really becomes obvious. Yes. And this is what they start going on about, the Bursar's on his dry bog pills. But again, suggesting that if he takes so many, he loses touch with reality a different way. Again, it sort of adds to the stigma of mental health medication, which is obviously vital for a lot of people, but also often stigmatised, which can make it hard for people to access. So... yeah, I mean, that's a whole problem that we know about now.
Yes, and so...
whereas when you read it as a kid, you're like, this guy's going to say some funny stuff.
Yeah, which...
it's one of those things like, it's of its time, but that feels like great now.
It doesn't detract massively,
But it is
there. And it is something that, as I say, the Bursar will still continue being a character and continue being this, which is a bit of a shame that we have that, but, we just acknowledge that...
it's in there.
Yeah, and, hopefully, if as we go forward, it might be not as bad as we seem to remember it being.
We'll have to see how we go.
Yeah. So there's that. We should mention Cassanunda, who turns up again.
And obviously, he turned up in Witches of Brawl. It's not been that long, but yes, Cassanunda, who ends up riding with the wizards because he's being a highwayman. And so there's some quite sort of funny banter there. So I think we talked before briefly about casting for some of the characters in this. There's a bit where Cassanunda hands Ridcully his calling card.
Yeah.
And it's got the, second greatest lover, was it stepladders? Yeah. It also says something about him being, was it like world's greatest liar or something?
Yes.
And for some reason, just at that point, all of his lines were in the voice of Peter Dinklage. And I was like, oh... And I'm like, well, that's not the worst casting in the world.
I think that could be quite a, and I think, Cassanunda, I think we possibly won't mention this when Richard's born, he's a very respectful dwarf.
Oh, again, it's this kind of thing where you have these dwarves, they're not like the other dwarves, so you had Hwel a bit with the playwriting. But with this, it's like Cassanunda being this very... Well, it's again, the joke is Cassanova. Yeah. He's a stashing lover and torture type, but also does a bit of being a highwayman and lying. And he's just a very flamboyant sort of character. And then it's quite interesting because before he was interested in Nanny Ogg, but they were busy. But in this, him and Nanny Ogg actually kind of go on a date. And he's trying to do all his seduction stuff. And Nanny Ogg's just like, oh, yeah, great oysters. And she's just like, I'm going to eat all of it. And he's like, oh, because he's used to doing courtship ladies. Yes. And that's not how Nanny Ogg is. And at first he's been like, oh, this is... Because she's not used to having this much seduction. So she's a bit like, oh, this is pleasant. What? but then suddenly he's like, oh, she goes everything like 110%. And he's like, oh. But then the elves turn up and ruin the date. And then she drags him to the long man, which
but
it's probably difficult to match up to. But then again, he doesn't let his size, stop him.
No, but he's very respectful. He doesn't feel like it's sleazy or
that is true. So it's sex positive.
Yeah,
it's sex positive ladies man. It's a bit like yes, he likes ladies and he likes having terrible ladies, but he's also not trying to undermine them or neg them or belittle them or like trick them into. I mean, I think the whole kind of liar thing is actually more with like when he's doing highwayman stuff and more like his courtier type thing.
He's just out to show Nanny Ogg a good time, and hopefully, have a good time later.
Together,
And I think it's just amusing that she's just there. She is having a great time. She's getting a load of free food, and she's most likely going to get a roll in the hay later. And she's quite up for that. And I think possibly Cassanunda is a bit more,
I think at one point
used to having to work for it a bit more.
Well, he's usually dealing with people who are at least putting up a kind of plausible deniability thing about this whole thing, and like Nanny's a bit like no. Because she's also very sex positive. At one point she does make a point about the age difference, but of course with dwarf lifespans he's actually like a good 100 years older than her. So, fine. Speaking of the Ogg family more broadly, there's also Jason Ogg, who, as we said, is the blacksmith, but he's also the leader of the Morris troupe, and they're doing the entertainment for the wedding. But instead of doing the Morris, because they wanted a thing called the bucket dance, and that went... That was a whole thing.
No one talks about it.
They're not doing it again. So then this is the bit that's really kind of relates to Midsummer Night's Dream, because this is not as focused on the Shakespeare play as like Weird Sisters was with like two different ones. It is Midsummer, and there are fairies. And I think there's one bit where somebody makes some comment about something being called mustard seed or something that's quickly passed away.
It's where Granny's fighting when facing off with the Queen. She talks about stories and basically pointing at one of the elves and calling it like peace flower, and basically the idea that that she could use story to kind of change the
no, that makes sense. But they have got a bit where all these guys who have these very trade jobs like weavers and tailors and bakers. There's also a whole thing, because obviously in the UK a lot of people have surnames like Baker and Taylor, and the whole idea is that everyone has a surname that's different to his job. So you've got like Baker the weaver and like Taylor the other weaver, and I can't remember what they all were. I know Cooper who mends fences. So that's kind of a joke, but he actually says something about rude mechanicals, and it's basically that bit, the kind of comedy relief bit in Midsummer Night's Dream where the artisan crafts people go and try to do a performance for a royal wedding. Doing the same thing. There's no bottom character who's trying to take all the roles, but everyone's a bit... The guy who's playing a woman is a bit aggrieved about it. But then the elves appear, and I think them doing... Because the whole thing in the story they're doing is there is a queen character, and then suddenly it's the actual queen. And Jason has enough knowledge. He's like, our mum said not to go up to the dances. Our mum said not to... Because they're doing, of course, the entertainment at the Stone Circle...
Well, they're practicing. They needed somewhere quiet to practice because they didn't want to be seen, especially the person playing the...
Yeah, it was a bit embarrassing. Yeah. Well, and that's the whole thing in Midsummer Night's Dream. That's where they go practice in the woods.
So they go practice. They go practice up at the dancers.
Yeah. And again, the other thing is that I suppose you've got a king and queen who are estranged, but, the king can kind of sort of stop the queen doing stuff. But what happens is they end up... The incursion happens, basically. I think that's how you describe it. So then they do the bucket dance because they realise that them dancing and singing or doing because it's calling, isn't it? But it's still musical. Oh, God, because the one guy got his...
You've got the accordion, yeah.
Which is sort of funny because it feels before accordions were invented, but never mind. But the point is they're doing folk dancing and music, and they've got the sticks. So they're basically travelling around as a Morris troupe, and all they're doing is they're moving around the countryside, basically hitting elves, because the elves are sort of slightly entranced and sort of attracted to the music and the dance. And it means they get close enough to hit them, then they can move away. It's not as effective at iron, but it does something. It's just kind of funny to have this group of people who just constantly you have to keep dancing. If we stop dancing, we die.
Yeah,
they travelling around,
going to various villages to spread the word and to hit elves on the head.
But yes, that's quite a fun bit. And as I say, obviously, Pratchett will return to Morris again. Has briefly mentioned it before, so it's obviously again, it's all that sort of folk tradition.
I mean, very much
very pastoral, rural stuff.
As far as sort of connections to the greater series, I think this is well embedded within the... we've got lots of connections to previous books.
Yeah, obviously there's The Witch series, the wizards come into it. It was interesting because I think we'd said before, moving pictures, there's a brief mention of elves in the background.
Yes, so there are elves in where they're talking about in the canteen.
Oh, they've got loads of species.
Yeah. And elves are, cool. So they do cover that in the elves. They're like human, half elves more than actual true elves.
Well, you say they covered that. That isn't actually specifically mentioned at all. We have assumed this.
No, it's mentioned in this that.
Oh, sometimes. Well, yeah, it's mentioned that sometimes there are elvish babies. It doesn't necessarily say that that's then what the people in the moving pictures are.
No, but I think we have to.
The inference is that. I think when Pratchett wrote that, he was like trolls and dwarves and elves, and he hadn't decided what they were doing. Yeah. And there was still an element of sort of riffing off of Tolkien stuff. Whereas this, I think, as I said, is in direct conversation with Tolkien. It's saying a bit like, well, Tolkien's saying all this, but actually at the ground level, it's this.
Yeah, I think there are people with elvish blood within the communities, but they are not elves. They just the only time I think it's mentioned in that sense is a pun in soul music, which we will get to. And then, as you say, there is in the Tiffany Aching book a bit more stuff, and then you get more fairy stuff in that because this again is very elves. It's specifically the kind of humanoid, pretty, fancy ones, and not the kind of boggarty, red cap, selkie, hob. Goblin-y type of we'll
creature.
Get to those later.
yeah. I suppose there's been a gnome so far.
Yeah,
but yeah.
But yeah, I think this is one that gets well embedded and stuff that continues on through.
Yeah, obviously it's the start of Magrat and Verence's marriage.
The young witches will eventually become.
Yes, I realised we didn't mention Granny's borrowing.
Oh yes, I mean that's. I mean, she's always been that's one of her.
We'll just do the end bit now. They think Nanny, after fighting with the Queen and not managing to stop her, and they think she's dead. And so Rid Cully takes her body and takes it into the castle, because they just met again, now she's dead, and he does he surround it with flowers or something, and he keeps everything, kind of closed and funereal. And then Nanny goes to look at Esme's box where she knows the will is, and the envelope addressed to her just has one thing in it, which is the card Granny uses when she's borrowing that says, I ain't dead. At which point her and Magrat are like, we have to go into the castle, you have to open the window, she cannot be in the dark. Because it's mentioned earlier, as she said, the bees hate elves and they attack them. But bees aren't one, you can't borrow a bee because it's just one part of a hive. Literally a hive mind.
Yeah.
But it turns out what Granny's done, and what no one else has managed to do, is she has borrowed a swarm of bees.
Yes.
And so the bees have to get to her to
allow her to switch back.
For her to come back, yeah. And then she's like, this whole thing Rid Cully's always trying to be all nostalgic and stuff, and she's a bit like, stop it, you silly man, sort of thing. Which sounds like probably how their relationship went a bit. But it's again, this thing, I think it's a bit of a thing where Granny does something very impressive, and for a while you don't know if it's worked. But then it turns out it has worked. That kind of increases her power. And again, it's one of these, in my head, I have certain books have classic Weatherwax endings, which are something like this.
Yes.
It's a bit like Granny's gone up against a foe and tried to best them, has she? Oh, yes.
Yes, she has.
Again, there's a lot of, I think, themes carrying through and
I think we're in a section that definitely takes takes what's been laid out in previous books and builds on it further. For reference, you definitely need to read this book. I think this is why if you like the Witches books, you need to. If you like the Wizards, if that particular,
they are also there.
I mean, I think it's worth reading for more of the history of Ridcully. But Stibbons is going to be important later. Mm-hmm. Go read Lords and Ladies. So next on the docket, he checks because he can never remember. We are returning to Ankh-Morpork.
Oh yes.
We are getting another Guards book. We get Men at Arms. The previous Guard book was 8th in the series, now 15th. So it's been a while. We've gone back to, we've seen the Witches a couple more times.
Yes, I mean, Men at Arms was actually the first Guards book I read, so it'd be very interesting to go back to that.
But yes, we're going back to Ankh-Morpork for some Guards, so that will be good. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to us waffle on as long as we have done.
Yes, thank you.
And we'll catch you all next time. Thank you for listening to Dining Table Discworld. You can find us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Dining Table Discworld. You can also find us on BlueSky at dtdiscworld. All our other contact information and credits for our music can be found in our show notes. Thank you for listening again, and we'll see you in our next episode.